All right, everybody, let's get started. I'm Gene Veith, retired English professor at Concordia Mequon and Patrick Henry and various places. So, since I'm retired, I especially like getting to go back to that and talk about some literary things at CCLE meetings. Um, yeah, when I do that, some people say, well, that was really good, really interesting what you talked about, but could you talk about how do you teach these works of literature you're discussing? And just want to say, one of the elements of classical education is focusing on content, on actually learning something. It's not just about techniques. There are all kinds of techniques you can use, but the purpose is to teach something valuable, teach something true and good and beautiful. And, a lot of you are the teachers. Let you figure out the different ways you can go about conveying this. What I liked, but whenever you're teaching a work of literature, whether it's C.S. Lewis or Homer or Huckleberry Finn or whatever, um, look for do a little bit of research, even if it's just little 10 minutes online or more, to see what is it about this work that makes it so good, that makes it so important. Why do people keep reading this year after year, generation after generation, century after century? And usually it's because it captures something, the author's trying to do something. There are themes, there are elements of just magnificence, of greatness. What is that? And when you're teaching this to your students and all the different ways you have in your bag of tricks, remember that's what you're trying to teach the student. Okay, not just reading it to read it, but you need to help your student make some discoveries and help the student learn something from this work and help the work sink in a valuable way. So what I'm going to be talking about with C.S. Lewis and his literary works, his fiction, his space fiction, Chronicles of Narnia, some of his more obscure things. I want to try to show you what he was trying to do or what's special about each of these works. And I bet you haven't read all of them that I'm going to talk about. Some of them be really good to use in the classroom, some maybe not. But I'm going to show you kind of what C.S. Lewis is doing in his works and tell you a lot about him. We heard some from Dr. Heck earlier. Some of what he said fit in well with what I'm going to get into, although I'm going to approach it from a kind of a different way. I know C.S. Lewis was not a Lutheran. And again, there are some things he gets into, as was said in the questions and answers for Luther. What? We don't believe that, do we? Kind of talk about what to do about some of those things too. We don't believe in the inerrancy of C.S. Lewis. I think some people do, but anyway, he's a great writer, very influential. He's influential in my life, and he's really fun to read and fun to teach and fun to learn from. Good. We have the world's authorities on C.S. Lewis, Dr. Heck here, my good friend. So feel free to help me out, Joel, and chime in on some of the things I'll be getting into. Lewis was known for a lot of different things, and I found that some people who know him in one area don't really know him very well in others. He is a apologists for Christianity, right? Mere Christianity and Problem of Pain, Miracles, so many other great works defending the faith, making the case for Christianity. He's also a great novelist, pioneer in the genre of fantasy literature. And in science fiction, he was very innovative at his time. I'll get into some of that. I knew him first as a novelist, reading one of his works of fiction. And then later I discovered Mere Christianity. He's writing about Christianity, and that kind of surprised me. When I got to graduate school studying English literature, I learned that he's a very prominent literary scholar, literary historian, a literary critic, and his writings on Milton and Spencer and medieval literature and Renaissance literature, they're still quoted all the time. And it was fun for me, who knew him from this other, to hear in completely different contexts come across Lewis quotations and people citing Lewis's approach and his understanding. So what I notice is how his different vocations, I guess you could say that. I always bring everything around to vocation, you'll notice. They really complement each other. And knowing about his scholarship helps us to understand his apologetics and his fiction. And his apologetics helps us understand his scholarship, and his fiction helps us understand his scholarship and his apologetics. And so as we go through this in these two sessions, I'm going to talk about how certain of what themes in Lewis, certain things he's trying to do, tie together, and how these different parts of his different vocations complemented each other, and I think become almost more than the sum of the parts. I want to start with Lewis's first book. Dr. Heck talked about it a little bit. First book he published under his name, The Pilgrim's Regress, published in 1933. That was 2 years after he became a Christian? This book is it's probably the least read of Lewis's books. It's one of my personal favorites, but I wouldn't say it's one of his best works. He was just starting out in many ways. But who's read it? Anybody? Okay, just a few of you. It's a takeoff on Pilgrim's Progress, the great 17th century story, Paul Bunyan, symbolic allegory about the Christian life. And Lewis is using that. It's a regress because he's going back to the faith of his childhood. He's not going forward, he's going back to what he once had but rejected. Dr. Heck's latest book, he wanted to call it C.S. Lewis Atheist. And I thought that was a great title. CPH pulled away from it. It's called now From Atheism to Christianity. Yeah, but the book is wonderful. It's about Lewis's life when he was an atheist. What did he believe? What did he not believe? What was his mindset? What was he reading? What was he thinking? And then tracing that, how he came to faith in Christ. And I recommend Dr. Heck's book. It's really good. But Lewis is telling that story, and he's in a symbolic way of someone who left the faith for various reasons and then eventually comes back to it. Pilgrim's Regress, it's very similar to Surprised by Joy, his autobiographical work, only this is in an allegorical form, symbolic story. And a lot of the philosophies that the pilgrim has to deal with are philosophies that no one really hears about anymore because they pretty much died out, showing that thought forms that at the time are so important for Lewis, so convincing, I guess Christianity must not be true. Those philosophies have died out, just as they tend to, many of them. Notice Christianity has not died out as much as people have tried to kill it off. Anyway, I don't want to focus on the book itself as such, but I want to look at the subtitle, which isn't even included in a lot of modern editions of Pilgrim's Regress. But I think it's the key, frankly, to understanding everything Lewis wrote. Okay, Pilgrim's Regress. An allegorical apology for Christianity, reason, and Romanticism. Yeah, that's what it says, an allegorical apology for Christianity, reason, and Romanticism. Okay, now, does that strike you as kind of an odd list? Okay, an allegorical apology. Okay, now this is something Lewis does throughout his writings, a defense by means of a symbolic story. That's what an allegory is. One of Lewis's great works in medieval literature, I'll get to that briefly, the allegory of love, where he basically teaches scholars how to read an allegory, because most of us have sort of forgotten how to do that. But you see his symbolic stories in the Chronicles of Narnia and the space stories, even Screwtape Letters, Great Divorce. But he's also writing apologies, defenses. Okay, apology for Christianity. Okay, familiar with that. He does a lot with that later. How about these others? An apology for reason and an apology for Romanticism. Okay, why is that strange? Why is that weird? I'll just ask you, we'll talk about it. Yeah. What? Okay, defending their left and right. We think of reason and Romanticism as opposites. Reason, okay, intellect, Romanticism, emotion, subjectivity, reason, objectivity, facts, Romanticism, feelings. First of all, they're opposites. Certainly think of them as opposites. Okay, he's defending both. Plus, do they need an apology? Do you need to defend reason in the 20th century? Do you need to in the 21st century? Yeah. C.S. is amazingly prescient. You're looking ahead to what's going to come. I mean, modernism was the age of reason in the 20th century. Rationality, reason, science. In postmodernism, in the very end of the 20th century and into our own day, postmodernists and universities reject reason. Okay, truth is not something we discover with our minds. We create our own truths. We're constructivists, or postmodernists are. And so when you look at Lewis today and find an apology for reason, actually that does resonate with a lot of issues today. But defending Romanticism, okay, the Romanticism was under attack when Lewis was writing in 1933. The modernists turned completely against the Romanticism. Not just because it was, that sloppy emotionalism, we follow reason and reason alone, but even in art. And I mean, the romantics, artists, the romantic poets like Wordsworth and Coleridge and Shelley, Keats, they write these beautiful, beautiful poems about the beauties and mysteries in nature, experience. And in the 20th century, reaction against that, poetry became bleak and dark and pessimistic and cynical, and romanticism, that was turned into an insult. Oh, you're just being romantic. Face up to the meaninglessness of life, everybody. Yeah, have a good day. And so Lewis was very interested in romanticism, not necessarily the way that we think of it today, but remember his search for joy. Dr. Heck talked about this. If you've read his autobiography, he would have these experiences of just transcendence. These moments. I mean, it would be little things. Beatrix Potter illustration in Squirrel Nutkin. You remember that? It just filled him with wonder and joy and aching longing. You know, he'd see one of them. His brother made a little model, a little diorama of leaves and moss, and it filled him with this yearning, this joy. He played music. Some Wagner would set it off. Read Euripides. I did not know that one, Dr. Heck. And so he was searching for that experience. So the Romantics search for experiences and were aware of a transcendence. And in nature, in just existence, sometimes there'd be something that would just break in. It would be glorious. And Lewis started to apply reason to it. It's like Dr. Heck was telling us about it. And he came to feel that this kind of experience pointed to something. There was evidence that there's a realm beyond this world, a realm we yearn for at some level. And anyway, that was one of the strains that eventually led him to faith. But everybody was scorning that, and Pilgrim's Regress is about that search for joy too. But reason, we think of reason and romanticism as opposites, don't we? But are they really? In terms of classical education, think about that. Is classical education just about rationalism and analyzing everything and getting the reasonable? Okay, we teach logic. We teach clear thinking. But that's not the whole of life, is it? We want people to feel rightly. We want people to, as we've been hearing, we want them to have a sensibility. We want them to have a sensitivity, a creativity. T.S. Eliot, who was one of the modernist poets, that Lewis hated his poetry because it was so bleak and depressing. Even after he became a Christian, Lewis liked the poetry of Shelley, who's an atheist, far better than T.S. Eliot, his fellow Christian. But Eliot talked about that the problem in modern life is what he called the dissociation of sensibility. It's like our minds have just come apart, where thinking and feeling used to be in harmony with each other. But now our thoughts go one way, our feelings go another, our emotions go one way, our intellects go another, and our minds are just kind of the basket of sharp knives, things that, and they don't really go together. And Eliot said, it didn't used to be this way. He said a poet like John Donne, he said, thinks his feelings and feels his thoughts. Okay. He feels things, but then he thinks about them. He thinks at his ideas, he feels his ideas. And Eliot saw a wholeness in the writings in the pretty much before the Enlightenment, before Christianity faded from its dominance. And I would add, when classical education started to fade. And Eliot, trying to put his mind and feeling together, came to Christianity. Christianity gave him a way to bring thought and feeling together again. And I think for Lewis, who was working separately from T.S. Eliot, I think he was seeing and maybe feeling in his own atheist days that same disconnect in his life. Christianity is a way to reconcile, among all the other things it does, reason and Romanticism, thought and feeling, subjectivity and objective truth. Christianity has to do with doctrines and truth claims, and it also is very personal. And so Lewis, I see this in Pilgrim's Progress, like Eliot, Christianity put his mind together again, put Humpty Dumpty together again, maybe you could say. Now it's odd because both reason was attacking Christianity. Oh, those miracles, they're not rational. You can't believe in them. That couldn't have happened. Because it was too subjective or too mystical or whatever. And Romanticism was also attacking Christianity, but for totally opposite reasons. Oh, all those dogmas Christians have, that's not important. All those doctrines and truth. What's important is the inner heart, right? What's important is the feelings, not all of those truth claims. Well, so reason is attacking Christianity from one side. Romanticism is attacking it from another. G.K. Chesterton made the comment that when someone is criticizing something for two different sides, or criticizing for an idea for opposite reasons, that's a good indication that it might be just true. Right? And anyway, I see Lewis making allegorical apologies for Christianity, certainly. He's a great evangelist. But he's also defending reason. He uses reason to defend Christianity, and a lot of us, including us church people, didn't think you could do that. Or he didn't think you should do that. But he does things like, either Jesus is who he said he was, what are the alternatives? Or he must be insane or lying or just a bad person, or he is who he said he is, the Son of God. And again, I don't think he's proving Christianity in his works by reason. I don't think you really can do that. I cannot by my own reason or strength believe in Jesus Christ. I don't think that's what he's really doing, but he's clarifying issues, helping us think clearly about them, and showing, okay, either this or that. And, a lot of people now say that Jesus was insane or that he was lying. I mean, you hear that today. Well, or is he telling the truth? So he uses reason, but he's also wanting to impact he wants to show us how mind-blowing Christianity is, how marvelous it is, how incredible it is. And he wants us to see that. And he's using Christianity to show us how remarkable and mind-blowing other things are. The creation, ordinary life, friendship. So he's not just content with just a kind of arid rationalism. He wants us to get this sense of transcendence and to become sensitive to it so we see it. So I think Lewis is doing this kind of in all of his writing. You could say in his nonfiction, in his apologetics, he's using reason. In his literature, he's trying, I think, to evoke some of these other feelings at the same time that he's making a case, even a rational case, an allegorical case for the Christian faith. So keep these three in mind as we go through and walk through some of the things Lewis has done. By the way, in Pilgrim's Regress, he shows this, that the pilgrim on one side of the path is these mountains of ice. Okay, and that's an allegory for rationalism. It's cold, it's unfeeling, the hard rocks, the cold, hard facts. But if that's what all you care about, it's like you're frozen. And on the left-hand side, there's a swamp. And that symbolizes Romanticism gone wrong. Where you just get off in it and you just sink into yourself, and you just, when you're really depressed and feeling bad, you just sink deeper and deeper into yourself, and it gets worse and worse, and to the point that you're kind of enjoying your own misery. And Lewis said you've got to avoid both of those extremes in favor of something much better, something much bigger than both of them. Okay, well, I want to talk briefly to set this up about some of the things Lewis said about literature, and then we'll be applying them to his writings, his literary scholarship. Again, the allegory of love. This was his first big scholarly book. He became a tutor at Oxford. Later, he became a professor at Cambridge. This was his first his first scholarly publication, and it had a huge impact on medieval literature. The allegory of love. And he tries to show people how to read this very popular form of allegories about romantic love. He's not talking about love in like the four loves. He's talking about romantic love as with the knights and the maidens. And there are a whole slew of books, mostly unreadable today, unless you really are uh, uh, a medieval specialist. Um, but Lewis showed how, not just what they symbolize, but kind of how they were written and how you need to enter into them. And his explanation of allegories, again, ties into his use of symbolic stories, even allegorical stories later. This is one of my favorite of Lewis's books. Again, I'm weird. I'm an English professor. English Literature in the 16th Century, excluding drama. What a bad title. It was one of the series of the Oxford History of English Literature, or as Lewis called it, oh hell. They're pretty dry books, and this was a huge project because he had to read. They said Lewis apparently read everything written in the 1500s. Okay. Now, a lot of that has survived, but that's mostly drama that has survived. Lewis is getting into the real, the stuff that has not survived, and sometimes for good reason. But no, there's some great writers like Spencer and Sidney, and Lewis is just brilliant in his analysis of those writers. But one of the things that I really, a theme there is he distinguishes between writers who are drab and writers who are golden. Okay, now the drab writers are, again, the dark, cynical, very realistic. Or John Donne is a drab writer. He's a great writer. He's a great Christian writer, but he's drab. Whereas Spencer writes these gorgeous, beautiful, the language, you can almost taste it, and if you read it out loud, and it's evoking all of these wonderful things. And so Lewis preferred the golden to the drab. He's kind of using loaded language here in his literary studies. But that's a key to his taste and what he tried to do. One of the things Lewis, his real ambition back then was to be a poet. And he did write some poetry. I don't think it's that good. Some of it is maybe. But he was really kind of bitter as a young man with his ambitions, because he was wanting to write golden poetry, and instead we got T.S. Eliot writing to the drabbest of the drab. And so the reason I say Lewis isn't a very good poet, when he started writing, he started trying to be drab, and he couldn't quite pull it off. Again, this was in his older days, mostly in his atheist days, but I think we'd be glad that he took the path that he did. But you might watch for that. Again, that sense of the transcendence, the amazing beauty, that's what he prized in literature and in experience and in faith. Okay. But we'll watch for that too. Another thing he wrote was called an experiment in criticism. And at the time Lewis was writing, in the 1950s, 40s, 50s, 60s, in the field, which became my field, English literature, there's a lot of different theories of criticism. How do you discuss a work of literature? How do you interpret it? How do you do it? The big thing was called the new criticism. You just take the work apart from its meaning. You look at its structure, you look at how it's organized, you look at the rhyme scheme and the structure, and that's it. Don't worry about what it's saying, about what it refers to. Just look at it as a self-contained artifact. Okay. Um, Now, Lewis, you might expect him to pioneer a distinctly Christian approach to literature. He doesn't really do that as such. He says that the question is, what does literature do to the reader? What is the impact of the work of literature? It didn't just say that, well, it's reference to the outside world, whether it's true or false. Well, a poem often doesn't even get into that kind of thing. But what does it do to the reader? And he talks about how it opens the imagination to other worlds. The writer's kind of creating an imaginative world, and when you read it, you're entering into that, for better or for worse. Okay. Again, think of what he's going to do later with Narnia, creating an imaginary world, and the other things that he's writing. But keep in mind, this is what he's aiming at with his work. It also includes a defense of popular forms, such as science fiction, but also fairy tales, mysteries, and at the time especially, and still to a certain extent, scholars, literary critics say, oh, well, that's not real literature. Science fiction, oh, well, yeah, that's really popular. People like it, but that's not really serious literature. To be serious, you've got to be, a modernist. You've got to be drab. You've got to write so complicated and such a complicated structure that it's like a puzzle that you have to figure out the puzzle before you can even understand it. That was what James Joyce and Eliot, to a certain extent, many others. But Lewis defended things like science fiction and other popular forms. What are some other popular forms? Westerns and I guess romance novels and things that even to today people are kind of maybe embarrassed that I'm reading this. But Lewis defends that. He says these create a certain world for people to enter into, and they're getting something from that. Maybe it's not complex, maybe it's, but that sympathy with what ordinary people like, I think that's one of the good things about Lewis and his legacy and his sympathy for ordinary people in general. But again, Lewis is going to go against the grain by writing science fiction, by writing children's stories. Not that he was trying to write children's story as such. He wrote an essay. Sometimes a children's story says it best what needs to be said. And see, he wasn't afraid of that. And it's ironic, of course, fantasy was also part of that. Tolkien, the modernist critics just look down their noses at Lord of the Rings. So, well, yeah, it's good, but this is just fantasy. This is just escapist. It's interesting that the work that survived, that was named the top book of the century, was Lord of the Rings and not, Ulysses or Finnegan's Wake or something like that. So anyway, Lewis is very interested in popular literary forms. All right, the first works that we'll talk about that he wrote fairly early in his career, the Space Trilogy. Out of the Silent Planet, the Paralandra, the Hideous Strength. How many of you have read those? Okay. Have any of you read one, but not all three? Okay. Did you read Out of the Silent Planet? Okay. Read Paralandra, is the only one. The Hideous Strength. Anybody read that? That's the only one. Oh, starting with that hideous strength. That takes a hideous strength to do that, I'll tell you. Yeah, right. Well, if you're in academia, if you're a professor, so much of it is about campus politics, and so some of us can appreciate it for that. Okay, but let me tell you what he was. Let me put these into the context of what Lewis is doing. Out of the Silent Planet. Now, this is considered in the history of science fiction to be a monumental leap forward in the science fiction genre. Now, Lewis conceived it as an answer to H.G. Wells, who's the big pioneer of modern science fiction. He wrote First Men on the Moon. You imagine somebody being shot with a giant cannon, a spaceship into the moon, and there they discover these bizarre insect-like creatures, the moon creature, the Selenites, and they capture them and torment them, and the Earthlings escape, and it's very exciting. And also then H.G. Wells' War of the Worlds, popularized by the great Orson Welles with this radio show where people thought the Martians are coming, the Martians have landed, and they are destroying Chicago. And Orson Welles was from Kenosha, Wisconsin, just up the highway here. And anyway, what Lewis did was to write a story where the aliens are not the monsters. We are the monsters. The Earthlings are the monsters. Okay, why are we monsters? That hideous string goes into that in some detail. Yeah. We're fallen. We're fallen. Now, in Lewis's mind, now I'm not sure this is quite totally theologically sufficient, but in his mind, yes, our world is fallen, but maybe another world isn't fallen. And in fact, he says that Earth is the anomaly. Earth is the strange place. He even describes the vast distances in outer space. The closest inhabited star is how many light years away, as God's way of quarantining us, so our infection doesn't spread to anybody else. And what he sets up on Out of the Silent Planet, again, I think we would say that, well, nature itself is fallen with a fall, and so all of creation is implicated in it. So, he may not be right there, but you see his point, and it's a fresh way of realizing our human sin. And what happens, a group flies to the moon, and they see these insect-like hideous monsters, just like H.G. Wells. And they're repulsive. Kill them, kill them, kill them. But it turns out, just because they look repulsive, it turns out they're good and even holy. And you start to see the Earthlings are the ones invading them. And, where the world Martian invading the Earth, how these Earthlings are invading this planet, the silent planet. Earth, they call Earth the silent planet. because it lacks, I don't remember specifically what he does with that. You can see it lacks the word, or it doesn't hear the harmony of the spheres, the music, it's everything. Anyway, now you'll see other science fiction works, science fiction movies where the humans are the bad guys and the aliens are the good. Avatar, which I think is a terrible movie, but there's kind of a crude example. But again, that goes back to Lewis. Lewis had the idea, and that he had that innovation. And it's an apology for Christianity, for the fall, and he sets up some other very thoughtful spiritual truths in the course of this very popular, very fun to read science fiction novel. Now, the next one, Paralandra, is about human beings trying to spread their infection, the infection of sin. And they go to a planet that is not fallen. And it turns out the human being plays the role of the serpent in the garden, trying to tempt the Eve of Paralandra, which is Venus, right? To find yourself, express yourself, turn away from this oppressive authority that you think you have to obey, find self-fulfillment. I mean, it's all the stuff we hear all the time in modern pop psychology. And they say, oh, this guy's possessed by Satan. And what he wants to do is to destroy this paradise, this land of freedom. And he imagines it as floating islands. Here, the Creator tells the woman, leave the floating island, go on the solid land. And the Creator tells her, don't do that. Stay off of the silent land. And so this scientist who was there in the first novel, he goes to Paralandra to help them, to help these alien people realize their full potential. And anyway, it's fascinating. It's also a very close rendition of Milton's Paradise Lost. Okay, and the Paradise Lost is truly the greatest works of English literature, an epic poem about the fall of Adam and Eve. And of course, behind that is the story in Genesis. And Lewis happened to be a great scholar of Paradise Lost, and he wrote a wonderful introduction to it called Preface to Paradise Lost. Now, how many of you have read Paradise Lost? Be honest. All right, good. I salute you. It's kind of a challenge to read, I guess. The most worth it of any other work you'll ever read. If you want to take it on, and as a teacher, at some point, you'll want to assign it to your students, read Lewis's Preface to Paradise Lost. It just opens up the text and just makes you appreciate it for all its challenges. And then and of course, Milton is the great golden poet. And Lewis will show you just how beautiful, magnificent Milton's writing is. But in Lewis's time, a lot of critics were saying, well, but Satan is the real hero of Paradise Lost. He's wanting liberation and freedom and all these qualities. This also talks about the fall of Satan. Better to reign in hell than serve in heaven. That wasn't just the Star Trek movie. Khan says, he was quoting Milton. And it is a great character Milton makes of Satan. And, why would Satan, this great angelic being, why would he rebel against God? And why would he want to, seduce Adam and Eve to be on his side? I think a lot of apologetic questions are not just intellectual questions, because you can figure out an answer to that. But sometimes they're imaginative problems. You can't really imagine it. You get an answer, but it's not satisfying because it doesn't satisfy your imagination. Milton does. Yeah.
You look at Satan and realize that when God created the angels, he created all good. There was no evil.
Yeah.
To tempt Satan. He created original sin on his own.
Okay.
Original sin being, I want to be God.
Yeah.
Over God.
Yeah. Okay. And that's the kind of thing that Milton gets into and that Lewis gets into in Paralandra. But anyway, Lewis answers that definitively. That issue of, Satan, the real hero. Lewis to this day will be quoted by literary scholars when this question comes up. So anyway, you might want to read Lewis's work, a scholarly work, and then you could read Milton. And it's also a very good way to get into the heart of Paralandra, which is basically the Garden of Eden in the fall for modern readers. Okay, now that hideous strength is very different. It's very different from anything else Lewis wrote. And this is because he was influenced by Charles Williams. Now, Charles Williams was another of the Inklings, like Tolkien and some others. And Williams was probably the most original and the oddest and the most different of the Inklings. Williams wrote realistic fantasies. Okay, Chronicles of Narnia. So many fantasies they're set in the Middle Ages, basically, which is interesting. I think why that might be. But anyway, other fantasies will have, magic or a lot of science fiction. It's just another kind of fantasy, but scientific technology plays the role of magic. When I remember watching the Star Wars movies while I was in grad school and immersed in medieval literature, and you still see all these guys wearing armor and fighting with swords. Okay, they're lightsabers and they're spacesuits, but it still wasn't rescuing princesses even. But anyway, Williams was writing realistic fantasies. They were drab, I guess. They're dark, cynical. T.S. Eliot loved them. And they're very psychological. They're very deep. They're very much worth reading. Let's start with, I would say, Descent into Hell would be a good one to start if you want to read Charles Williams' novel. Very Christian and yet very, very different. And so Lewis became a close friend of Williams. And in this third volume, he's writing a Charles Williams novel. It's a realistic setting, in this case, an academic research institution kind of place. But he sees realized things that he would write about later. An abolition of man, Dr. Heck told us about, when education starts denying the objective moral values or objective values of any kind. Lewis said it leads to the abolition of what is human. Okay, that's what messed up education can do. It can hurt our very humanness. the abolition of man. And in this work, Lewis shows that, because these academics are becoming more and more inhuman. It's also a dystopia. Again, you had George Orwell around this time writing 1984. You know, a utopia is a fantasy of a society where everything is so good. Everything is so great. We'll solve all of our problems. A dystopia is a future where society becomes so very, very bad. 1984. Then Aldous Huxley wrote Brave New World, even more relevant to our time, about people the government controlling people by keeping them entertained. And he anticipates virtual reality. They put on a headset and they take a drug. And this is so wonderful. They don't care about freedom. They don't care about what the government is doing to them. Huxley anticipates genetic engineering. There's no families. Sex has nothing to do with procreation. The government uses artificial means to breed as many human beings as they need for the factories and the armies and everything. Anyway, that's a dystopia. And Lewis is contributing to that. At one point, in one of his apologetics works, he fears the scientist as a material, that science could turn into a materialistic magician. That the superstition and idolatry and the way people look at the scientist, he can do anything. He can do magic. Okay. Explain how a computer works. Isn't that magic? To most of us, we've already probably gone that way. And so many people look to science, not understanding anything about not understanding the science, but we trust in science. And anyway, Lewis shows how that can go terribly wrong. But again, this is a science fiction trilogy, and it's very it's very good, and it's worth reading from the beginning. If you're only going to read one, or to teach it to young people, they might not quite be ready for that hideous strength, not because it has anything wrong with it, but maybe it's just beyond their experience. He talks about, well, maybe it is. He talks about the inner ring, wanting to be in the inner circles, wanting to be one of the cool people, wanting to be one of the people that has prestige, whether it's in the university or in the profession or on the job. High school students have experience with that. Anyway, that's good. Now, next, Lewis did some apologetic novels. By this time, Lewis had begun writing works of apologetics. Mere Christianity, based on his radio broadcast during the war, put together in Mere Christianity, started addressing others, miracles, problems of pain, wonderfully helpful works. But then he started using imaginative literature for his apologetics. Not just doing it as arguments, but telling stories. The two are Screwtape Letters and The Great Divorce. Okay, now the Screwtape Letters, this was the first work of Lewis that I came upon when I was in high school. And it really blew me away. As you know, it's in the form of advice from a devil to another devil who's trying to tempt this young man and to lead him to hell. And so everything is turned upside down. And it reads, the devil is commenting on the patient and his foibles and how he can best get to him. Now, this is a great book. I've read it many times at different stages in my life, and it speaks in a different way because I think the devil tries to get to me in different ways, depending on where I am in my life. And a lot of people read that not noticing what a work of not noticing that it's a novel of rare skill. It's an epistolary novel. The very earliest novels were collections of fictional letters where the different characters would write letters commenting on what they're going through. And this was a way for the early novelist in the 1700s to get inside the minds of the characters. The very first novels were collections of letters. Later writers use that too. Bram Stoker's Dracula is an epistolary novel. It's, dear so-and-so, we had a strange shipment from Transylvania. A big box about the length of a human being was delivered. And, and you have all these ironies because you know more than the letter writer knows. And anyway, and of course he's experimenting with point of view. By telling it all through the devil's point of view. And other of the modernist novels, the modernist writers, Lewis said, like, they were trying to do it, some of this too, but Lewis, I think, was doing it so much better. And he's also experimenting with the comic form. In the Middle Ages, a comedy is a story that begins in pain and ends in joy. And a tragedy begins in joy but ends in pain. Now, this novel, if you track out the plot of it, you would think it would be a tragedy, because just as his life, the patient's life gets put together, he falls in love, he's going to get married, everything is looking up for him, and then he's killed. It's during the war. Bomb falls on him, blown to bits. And typically we would say, oh, how sad. But in this, Screw Tape, the devil, he's furious. Now he's with us. Now he's with the enemy, meaning Christ. Now he's with the enemy. You fool, you've lost your chance. You didn't get him. You didn't win him over to us. And so what would be a sad ending turns out to be a happy ending. What might be seen as a tragedy from one point of view is a comedy from another point of view. And since he's been playing with our point of view and messing with us so much, you can really see that. Anyway, it's a brilliant book. I just learned that there's a postmodern novelist, let's see, David Foster Wallace, am I saying? Something like that. He has about 3 first names. Big postmodern. This is his favorite novel. This is his favorite book, which made me think there's maybe more to him than I realized. The other one, and we have to finish quickly, The Great Divorce. Now, this is a response to another work of literature. William Blake, the early Romantic poet, wrote a series of poems called The Marriage of Heaven and Hell. And Blake thought that, oh yes, heaven and hell, the end will come together. Satan and God will reconcile. Evil and good will come together and we'll all live happily ever after. Lewis said, no, it's the divorce of heaven and hell. Why they're different. The splitting off. And, Lewis was no universalist. In fact, he writes more about hell than about any modern writer that I'm aware of. Again, he did write that some people might be able to, well, we'll get into that. But that Christ would let them in, but no, but hell is a reality. And Lewis made that clear through a symbolic story. It's also like the medieval writings that he so interested in, because it's a dream vision. The speaker in the work, he falls asleep, and it's just a dream. Just a dream. A dream is a way that we can, all the weird things happen in our mind, and at the time when we're asleep, they seem perfectly normal. And it's also a modern re-imaging of Dante's Divine Comedy. As Dante writes about a journey through hell up to heaven, Lewis describes a bus ride from hell to heaven, but the damned don't like it in heaven, and so they want to get back to hell. Anyway, we'll talk about that. All right. Next time, we'll talk about the Chronicles of Narnia as a whole and each of the works and Lewis's other writings. So we'll go through there. Hopefully we'll have time for discussion and questions, but we'll push our way through here and I think get a good sense of Lewis's literary contributions. All right, until then, I will see you.